At a black-tie charity gala in Manhattan, Claire Whitmore sat motionless in her wheelchair at the edge of the ballroom while the music played and no one asked her to dance. One by one, the men in tailored suits looked away, and two of them laughed loud enough for the whole room to hear, calling her a decorative piece, a statue with a name tag. Not one person stepped forward. Then a man in a faded charcoal vest crossed the room, crouched down in front of her, and said he wanted to dance. The room laughed. Then Claire stood up. The Whitmore name meant something in this city. It meant a floor of a hospital bearing your last name, a foundation with an annual budget larger than most people's lifetimes, and an invitation to a gala that no one in Manhattan's upper circles would decline. Richard Whitmore had built his medical empire across 3 decades, and tonight's charity event at the Grand Meridian Hotel was the kind of evening that reminded everyone exactly who he was, and exactly who his daughter was supposed to be. Claire had not wanted to come. She had said so twice at dinner the week before, and once more in the car on the way over. But Richard had a way of framing things that made refusal feel like cowardice. He had not pressured her directly. He had simply said that people needed to see her. That absence only fed the rumors, and that she was still his daughter, regardless of what 2 years had done to her legs. She had said nothing after that. She had let the car take her here. The Grand Meridian Ballroom was exactly the kind of room that made people feel small if they let it. 3 crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling that climbed 40 feet overhead, and the walls were lined with white floral arrangements that cost more than most monthly rents. Round tables filled the perimeter, covered in ivory linen, and the center of the room had been cleared for dancing. A live orchestra played near the far wall strings first, then brass easing in underneath, and the sound was beautiful in the way that beautiful things sometimes feel like pressure when you are already struggling to breathe. Claire sat near the edge of the cleared floor in her wheelchair, wearing a deep navy gown that her stylist had chosen because it photographed well and because the color was dignified. Her dark hair was pinned back with 2 small clips, and her posture was straight because she had trained herself to keep it that way, not out of pride, but because slumping invited a certain kind of pity that she found harder to absorb than open cruelty. She watched the room with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that movement drew attention, and attention rarely brought anything she wanted. Her father stood across the room with a circle of board members and donors laughing at something she could not hear. He glanced over at her every few minutes, in the way that parents do when they are trying to appear relaxed, but are not. Claire looked away each time before he could catch her eye. The accident had happened 2 years ago on a trail outside of Westchester. The horse had spooked at something in the brush, she never found out what, and the fall had compressed 2 vertebrae in her lower spine. The surgeons had been precise and cautious in the way that surgeons become when the patient's last name is on a wing of their building, and the outcome had been what they called a partial injury. She could feel pressure and temperature in both legs. She could not walk. At least, that was what 2 years of failed attempts had confirmed, and she had eventually stopped trying because the trying had become its own kind of damage. She did not like thinking about the accident in rooms like this one, so she focused instead on the music and on the way the light caught the rim of the champagne glass she was holding, but not drinking from. The dancing started gradually the way it always did at these events. Couples moved to the floor in 1s and 2s, finding the rhythm, and the room grew warmer and louder as the evening settled in. A few men Claire recognized from her father's circle approached the table near her, not to speak to her, but to speak around her, reaching past her orbit to greet colleagues and laugh at stories she wasn't part of. She was used to it. Being near people had started to feel different from being among them, and she had accepted more or less that those were 2 separate things now. What she had not prepared for was what happened next. One of the men broad-shouldered somewhere in his early 40s, with the confident looseness of someone who had never been told no by a room, stopped beside her table and looked at her with an expression that was almost friendly. His name was Grant Holloway. She knew him vaguely from previous events, back when she had still attended them on her own 2 feet. He had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a compliment, until you listened closely enough to realize it wasn't. He said that it was good to see her out again. He said it the way people say things they do not mean, but feel entitled to say anyway. And Claire thanked him, because she was not in the mood for a confrontation in the middle of her father's event. Then one of the men beside Grant made a joke about the orchestra playing a waltz, and Grant looked down at her wheelchair, with an expression that shifted just enough for her to catch it, a flicker of something between discomfort and amusement, and said that it was a shame she couldn't join them on the floor. Not a shame for her, a shame in the abstract, like a closed restaurant or bad weather. His companion laughed, and then Grant laughed too. And then the moment passed, the way those moments always passed quickly without acknowledgement, leaving her to absorb it alone, while the conversation moved on to something else entirely. They drifted away, and she set her champagne glass down on the table, because her hand had started to feel unsteady, and she did not want anyone to notice that. The orchestra transitioned into a slower piece, and several more couples moved to the floor. Claire watched without meaning to, tracking the way bodies moved together, the way a man placed a hand at the small of a woman's back, and the woman leaned slightly into it. She had danced at events like this one before the accident. She had been good at it, not trained, but naturally easy in the way some people are when they are comfortable in their own bodies. She had not thought about that in a long time. She thought about it now. A server moved past her with a tray of glasses, pausing to ask if she needed anything, and she said, "No, thank you," and the server moved on. This was the texture of the evening, people appearing briefly at the edge of her attention, and then receding. None of them landing. None of them staying long enough to become real. Then a man named Derek Sutton, whose family ran a private equity firm, and who had drunk enough of the open bar to loosen whatever internal filter he'd arrived with, walked past her table with 2 companions and said something quietly, but not quietly enough. He used the phrase decorative piece. He said it while gesturing in her direction, and one of his companions pressed his lips together in the way people do when they want to laugh, but know they should not quite yet. The third man in the group looked at the floor. Claire did not move. She kept her expression level and her shoulders back, and she breathed slowly through her nose. And she told herself that it did not matter that he was drunk and small, and that what small people said in rooms like this one had no authority over her. She told herself this, and she mostly believed it, but her jaw had tightened, and her hands had settled flat against her thighs, in a way that she recognized as the body's version of bracing for impact. The room had not gone silent. No one had heard it but her and the 3 men, and possibly the server with the tray, who was now walking in the other direction. But the room felt different after that, in the way a room always feels different once something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Louder somehow, and more indifferent, and she was suddenly very aware of the space between her table and the nearest exit. She was thinking about that exit, measuring the distance, calculating whether she could leave without her father noticing for at least 10 minutes, when she saw Lucas Bennett for the first time. He was standing near the service corridor on the far side of the room, holding a clipboard and speaking in a low voice to one of the catering staff. He was 35, though he looked older in the tired way that grief makes people look older. Not worn down exactly, but weighted, as if some part of him was always carrying something that wasn't visible from the outside. He wore a charcoal vest over a white dress shirt, and the vest had the slightly faded quality of something that had been good once and had been worn often since. His dark hair was cut short, and his expression, even from across the room, had the focused neutrality of someone who had trained himself not to feel too much in public spaces. He was not a guest. He was managing the evening's logistics for the hotel, which meant he had been here since 4 in the afternoon, and would likely still be here well after midnight, making sure that nothing went wrong in ways that anyone would notice. This was what he did now. It was not what he had always done. 4 years ago, Lucas had been in the final year of a physical therapy graduate program, working clinical hours at a rehabilitation center in Brooklyn, and doing well enough that 2 of his supervisors had pulled him aside to tell him he was the kind of therapist patients actually responded to. Then his wife died a sudden cardiac event, no warning, no chance to prepare, and the world had rearranged itself in the way that worlds do after something irreplaceable is removed from them. He had taken a leave of absence from the program. The leave had stretched into a withdrawal. He had stopped returning calls from the department, and eventually stopped checking his email from that account entirely. He had found different work. Quieter? Work that asked very little of him emotionally, and he had settled into a life that functioned the way a room functions, when all the furniture has been pushed to the walls, technically usable, technically fine, but not quite lived in. He finished his conversation with the catering staff and marked something on his clipboard, and looked up, and that was when his eyes moved across the room and landed briefly on Claire. He noticed her the way you notice something that does not fit the pattern, not because she was conspicuous, but because she was too still. Everyone else in the room was in motion, leaning towards someone, or away from someone, laughing, or pretending to lifting glasses and setting them down. She was simply sitting there, spine straight, hands flat, watching the dance floor, with an expression so carefully controlled, it told him everything it was trying to hide. He looked away. He had a job to do, and the evening was moving forward, and it was not his place to notice things about the guests. He moved along the perimeter of the room toward the next item on his list. He was near the east corridor when he heard the laughter. It was not the general laughter of the room. It was targeted and low, coming from a cluster of men near the bar who were looking in Claire's direction, while one of them, the broad one who had been talking loudly all evening, mimicked something with his hands and gestured toward the wheelchair. Lucas did not hear what was said. He did not need to. He had worked events long enough to recognize the specific configuration of men who were being cruel and knew they would face no consequences for it. He looked at Claire. She had heard it too. Her posture had not changed. She had not collapsed, or looked away, or done anything that would give them the satisfaction of a visible reaction. But something around her eyes had shifted a tightening at the outer corners that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. Her hands, flat on her thighs, had pressed down just slightly harder than before. The orchestra moved into a waltz. Lucas set his clipboard down on a service cart near the wall. He was not thinking carefully about what he was doing. He was not weighing options or calculating outcomes. He was simply moving the way the body moves when the mind has already decided something and is just waiting for the rest of the system to catch up. He crossed the ballroom floor with the same unhurried pace he used for everything, which meant that by the time people began to notice him, he was already most of the way there. He stopped in front of Claire's wheelchair, and he crouched down so that he was at her eye level, and he said, "I know this is unexpected, and I realize we haven't been introduced. My name is Lucas. I work for the hotel." He held out his hand, not performatively, not with the expectation of being charmed, but in the straightforward way of someone who was simply completing a sentence. "I'd like to dance with you if you're willing." Claire looked at him with a careful measuring look that was taking in his expression, his posture, the fact that his vest was faded, and his hand was already half extended, and he was not smiling in the pitying way that people smiled at her. He was just looking at her, evenly waiting. Around them, the room had begun to notice. Someone at the bar made a sound, not quite a laugh, but the precursor to one. Someone else said something to their companion in a low voice, and the companion looked over with the expression of a person settling in to watch something embarrassing unfold. Claire was aware of all of it. She was aware of her father across the room who had gone very still. She was aware of Grant Holloway near the bar, who had turned to face them fully now. She was aware of the distance between her hands and the wheels of her chair, and the distance between who she had been before the accident and who she had become in the 2 years since. She was also aware of something she had not expected to notice: a slight movement in her left leg when Lucas had crouched down in front of her. Not a full movement, not a voluntary one. Just a small, involuntary shift of muscle, the kind of thing that happened sometimes when she was startled or moved. The kind of thing the doctors had called residual neuromuscular activity, and her own body had called nothing because she had stopped listening to it. Lucas had noticed it too. She could see it in the way his eyes moved just briefly to her legs and then back to her face. He did not say anything about it, but his hand remained extended, and his expression did not change, and he was still waiting. The waltz continued. Claire looked at his outstretched hand for a moment that felt longer than it was. Behind her, someone laughed. In front of her, a man she had known for approximately 90 seconds was offering her something she could not quite name. Not pity, not performance, not the complicated charity of someone who wanted credit for being good. Just an outstretched hand, and a direct request, and a pair of eyes that were looking at her like she was a person who was capable of making a decision. She reached out and took his hand. The laughter that followed was not the sharp, sudden kind. It was the slow, spreading kind, moving through a room like a temperature change person to person, as people registered what they were seeing and decided how to respond. A hotel employee in a faded vest had just asked the Whitmore daughter to dance. The Whitmore daughter, who had not stood on her own in 2 years, who had arrived in a wheelchair and would presumably leave in one, had just taken his hand. The room found this either touching or absurd, and the people in it divided themselves quietly along that line, though the absurd camp was louder. Lucas did not appear to notice the laughter. If he did, he gave nothing away. He simply rose from his crouch, still holding Claire's hand, and positioned himself beside her chair with the deliberate calm of someone who had decided on a course of action and was not interested in reconsidering it. He placed one hand at her arm and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "You don't have to stand. We can do this however feels right to you. But I want you to try something first. I want you to press your feet down into the footrests, both of them, as hard as you can." Claire looked at him. It was a strange instruction, not the nervous reassurance or careful apology she had braced for. She pressed her feet down the way he asked, and felt the footrests push back against her soles, and then felt something she had not felt in a very long time, a faint answering resistance from her own muscles. Not movement, not strength, just the signal that something beneath the surface was still trying. Lucas watched her face. He had seen that expression before in patients at the rehabilitation center in Brooklyn, in the specific moment when they discovered that their body had not entirely given up on them, that the line between can and cannot was not always where the paperwork said it was. He had not worked in that field in 4 years, but the knowledge had not gone anywhere. It had just been sitting in him, unused, the way a language you stop speaking stays somewhere in the mind, waiting. He said, "Your left leg responded when I crouched down earlier. I noticed it." He kept his voice level, not dramatic, not urgent. "That doesn't mean you can walk across the room, but it might mean you can stand. And if you can stand, we can dance." Claire said nothing for a moment. Across the ballroom, her father had taken 2 steps in her direction, and then stopped, held in place by some combination of uncertainty and the social instinct not to make a scene. Grant Holloway near the bar had his arms crossed and was watching with the attentive expression of a man who expected to be entertained. Derek Sutton, the one who had called her a decorative piece, had turned his back, either from disinterest or from the dim, unexamined awareness that watching might require him to feel something he preferred not to feel. Claire looked at the dance floor. 20 feet of open hardwood gleaming under the chandeliers, surrounded on all sides by people in evening wear who were now watching her with varying degrees of concealment. She looked at Lucas, who was still beside her, with the same unhurried expression, not pushing, not pleading, just present. She thought about the footrests and the resistance and the faint effort her legs had made. And she thought about the 2 years she had spent not thinking about things like that, because the thinking had always ended the same way, with the floor coming up too fast, and her body refusing to cooperate, and the particular silence of a room where everyone has just watched you fail. She said, "If I fall, this is going to be very bad for both of us." Lucas said, "If you fall, I'll catch you." That's not a figure of speech. She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, more the shape of one, the structural beginning of something that hadn't fully decided to arrive yet. She reached up and took his arm. Getting out of the wheelchair was not graceful. It was not the movie version of the moment where the music swells and the body obeys, and everything resolves into something clean and visible. It was slow and uncertain, with Lucas bearing most of her weight and adjusting constantly, one hand at her waist and one at her forearm, compensating for the unpredictable way her legs were responding, the left one doing more than expected, the right one doing almost nothing. Claire's jaw was tight and her breath was shallow, and she was keenly, painfully aware of every person in the room who was watching, which at this point was nearly everyone. She made it to standing. For 3 seconds, she was fully upright, her hands gripping Lucas's arms, her body swaying slightly but not falling. 3 seconds was not long. In the context of 2 years, it was enormous. The room had gone quieter. Not silent, the orchestra was still playing. Some of the conversations at the tables were still continuing, but the quality of the noise had changed, and the people nearest to the dance floor had stopped what they were doing and were now simply watching. Lucas began to move with her, small and deliberate, guiding her weight from side to side in the slow rhythm of the waltz. He talked to her quietly while they moved, not about the dancing, but about what her body was doing, the way a trainer talks to someone learning a new physical skill. He told her to think about the pressure in her left heel. He told her to let her hips follow the movement rather than trying to control it. He told her that the goal was not steps, not yet. The goal was balance, the small, constant negotiation between weight and gravity that most people never had to think about consciously because their nervous system did it automatically. Hers had forgotten how. He was trying to remind it. Claire was listening. She was listening with the focused attention of someone whose instructions are the only thing standing between her and the floor. She was also trying very hard not to look at the room around her, because the room around her was full of people whose faces she could see in her peripheral vision. And the faces were doing things she didn't know how to process. Some of them were very still. Some of them had hands raised to their mouths, and near the bar, at least 2 of the men who had been laughing earlier had stopped laughing entirely. She felt the shift in her left leg first, a genuine muscular engagement, brief, but real, as her body tried to compensate for a change in balance. It was not a step. It was not voluntary. But it was hers, and it was happening, and Lucas felt it too, because his hold on her adjusted immediately, giving her just enough room to feel it without losing her footing. He said quietly, "There, that was you." She wanted to say something back, but she didn't, because if she opened her mouth right now, she was not entirely certain what would come out, and this was not the kind of room where she wanted to find out. Richard Whitmore had moved closer. He was standing about 10 feet from the edge of the dance floor, his hands at his sides, his expression carrying the specific tension of a man trying to decide whether what he was witnessing was a miracle or a catastrophe. He had built a medical empire on the premise that bodies could be fixed, that with sufficient resources and expertise, most damage was reversible. And yet his own daughter had been assessed by the best specialists his money could access, and every one of them had told him the same thing: partial injury, limited prognosis, probable permanent mobility limitation. He had accepted this because he had been told to accept it by people who used language that made acceptance feel like reason. He was watching her stand on the dance floor of the Grand Meridian Hotel, supported by a man in a faded vest who worked logistics, and he did not know what to do with what he was seeing. Then Grant Holloway spoke. He had spent the last several minutes at the bar growing increasingly agitated, not out of concern for Claire, but out of the particular discomfort of a man who had helped set the room's tone earlier in the evening, and was now watching that tone turn against him. He said it to his companion at a volume that was not quite private. "This is a liability issue. If she falls, the hotel gets sued. Someone needs to stop this." His companion made a sound of agreement, and Grant set down his drink and moved toward the floor with the purposeful stride of a man who had decided he was the appropriate person to intervene, which was, Claire would later think, entirely consistent with everything she had ever known about him. He reached the edge of the dance floor and addressed Lucas directly. "I think that's enough. This isn't appropriate." His voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, and he looked at Lucas the way men like him look at hotel staff, with the specific blankness that means you exist to me only as a function, and right now, your function is to step aside. He added, "She's not well. You're going to hurt her." Lucas looked at him steadily. He did not move. He said, "She's standing. That's her decision to make." Grant turned to Claire, then his expression shifting into something he probably believed was concern, but wore more like management. He said, "Claire, your father is right here. Let's get you back to the table." Claire looked at Grant Holloway. She had known him for years, not well, but enough to recognize the specific way he occupied rooms. The assumption underneath every gesture that the world was organized around people like him, and that everyone else was a variable to be managed. She had been a variable to him for 2 years, ever since the wheelchair, and before that, she had been a different kind of variable. The right kind, the socially useful kind. She understood, looking at him now, that his concern was not for her. It was for the room, and for the story the room was telling, and for the fact that the story was no longer one he controlled. She said, "I'm fine where I am." Grant's expression tightened slightly. He looked at Richard across the room in the wordless communication of men who believe they are managing a situation together. Richard did not move immediately, but Claire saw him take a breath and start forward, and she felt something in her chest tighten in response, the old familiar weight of being handled, of being the problem that needed solving rather than the person who got to decide. Lucas felt her grip change. He felt the slight increase in pressure in her hands and the corresponding shift in her center of gravity that meant she was pulling back, retreating in the way that people retreat when the world closes in on them, not physically, but internally, the progressive contraction of someone preparing to disappear. He had seen it before in that other life, with patients who were weeks into recovery and faced with their first real obstacle after an early success. The moment when the full scale of the effort required suddenly revealed itself, and the gap between where they were and where they needed to be looked too wide to cross. He said her name just once, quietly enough that Grant and the gathering crowd could not catch it, and when she looked at him he said, "Don't go back yet. You don't owe this room anything, but you might owe yourself another 30 seconds. Claire's legs were shaking, the right one more than the left, and the left one more than it had been 5 minutes ago, and the shaking came not just from muscle fatigue, but from everything else, from 2 years of stillness, and the weight of this room, and the sound of laughter that had already happened, and the fear of the laughter that might still come. She felt the tears before she knew she was going to cry, that specific, unwanted pressure behind her eyes that she had spent 2 years learning to suppress in public. Her grip on Lucas's arms tightened, not for balance now, but for something harder to name. She wanted to go back to the chair. The chair was safe. The chair was the thing she had built her life around for 2 years, and it was right there, 7 feet behind her, and nobody would blame her for returning to it. Everyone in this room, including the people who were watching with something that looked like hope, would understand if she sat back down. They would say she was brave. They would not say it where she could hear it, but they would think it, and the thought would follow her home and sit with her in the morning, and become part of the architecture of the next 2 years if she let it. She could feel her father arriving at the edge of the crowd, She could feel the room's attention compressing around her like something physical, and she could feel still the faint, stubborn signal from her left leg, not loudly, not reliably, but persistently, the way a sound carries farther than expected in a quiet room. Lucas did not try to hold her in place. He did not increase his grip or brace against her pulling away. He simply kept the same steady, even contact he had maintained since she rose from the chair, and he said what he said. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with the directness of someone who had decided that honesty was more useful than comfort. Nobody in this room can see who you actually are, but you have the right to see yourself. He did not say it like a speech. He said it like a fact, the same way you state a distance or confirm a direction. Claire stood on the dance floor of the Grand Meridian Ballroom, shaking with tears, threatening, and her father 10 feet away, and a man she had known for less than 20 minutes holding her upright. And she looked at the gleaming hardwood beneath her feet and thought about the horse trail in Westchester and the fall and the 2 years that had followed the fall. And she thought about all the decisions she had made in those 2 years that had felt like acceptance and had perhaps been something else entirely. She looked up. She looked at Lucas. She tightened her grip on his arms, not to lean on him, but to anchor herself, and she said, "One more time." He nodded. He adjusted his hold, and the music continued. One more time turned out to mean something different than either of them had expected. Lucas adjusted his hold, right hand at her waist, left hand taking hers, and began to move again, with the same slow, measured rhythm as before, but something in Claire had shifted. Not physically, not yet. The internal negotiation that had been running since she first rose from the chair, the constant calculation of risk versus retreat of how much exposure she could survive, had reached some kind of resolution, and the resolution was not the one the room had been waiting for. She was not going back to the chair, not yet, not like this. Her left leg moved. It was not a full step, not the clean, deliberate transfer of weight that walking requires, but it was directional, purposeful in a way that the earlier muscle responses had not been. Her foot shifted forward by perhaps 4 inches, and her body followed, and Lucas felt it happen, and did not react. Visibly, did not say anything, or look surprised, simply adjusted his weight to support her, and kept moving. Claire felt it too, with a stunned, disoriented recognition that she had not anticipated. Her left foot had moved. She had moved it. She was not entirely certain she had done it on purpose, but she had not done it on purpose either, and that distinction felt important in a way she couldn't yet articulate. The room had gone very quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience being respectful, the involuntary quiet of people who were watching something they had not expected to witness and did not yet have a framework for. The conversations at the surrounding tables had stopped. The cluster of men near the bar, including Grant Holloway and Derek Sutton, had turned to face the dance floor fully, their glasses held loosely in hands that had forgotten they were holding them. Even the orchestra had dimmed slightly, not stopping, but pulling back the conductor, having noticed the shift in the room's attention, and made the instinctive choice to let it breathe. Richard Whitmore stood at the edge of the floor, no longer moving toward his daughter. He was very still, and his face carried the expression of a man in the presence of something he does not know how to categorize. Not happiness, not yet, but something raw and anterior to happiness. Something that lives in the body before the mind has had time to name it. Claire took another movement forward. The right leg this time less responsive, more reluctant, but it shifted fractionally, and her weight redistributed, and she did not fall. Lucas held her with the same calibrated steadiness, neither pulling her forward nor holding her back, simply making the space around her safe enough that she could use her own judgment about what came next. She was crying. She had not decided to cry, and she could not stop it, and she did not try. The tears moved down her face while she moved, and she did not wipe them because both hands were occupied, and because stopping to wipe them would have required breaking the momentum of whatever this was, and she was not willing to break it. Not for composure. Not for the room. Lucas said, still quietly, still close. "You're doing it," she said. "I know." She said it like she was angry, and she wasn't at him, not at the room, but at the 2 years, at the accumulating weight of what she had accepted and what she had been told to accept, and what she had eventually stopped questioning because the questioning had cost too much. She was angry in the specific way that comes when you realize a door you believed was locked from the outside was locked from the inside all along, and the key had been yours the entire time. She took 3 more movements across the floor. They were not elegant. They were not the waltz that the orchestra was playing. They were something slower and more effortful, a controlled shifting of weight, rather than any recognizable dance form. But they were forward, and they were hers, and each one happened because she decided it would happen, and that was the thing that mattered, the thing that was different from every other moment in the 2 years that had preceded this one. The room broke before she did. A single sound at first, someone near the back of the ballroom, a woman whose name Claire didn't know, who made a sound that was not quite a word, and covered her mouth with her hand. Then someone else. Then a collective sound that moved through the room, the way that first laughter had moved through it, person to person, but in the opposite direction, not outward and dismissive, but inward and involuntary, the sound of people being undone by something they were not prepared for. Richard Whitmore's face had changed completely. The corporate control he wore in rooms like this one, the practiced composure of a man who had built a life on appearing to have everything in hand, had dissolved into something much older and much simpler. He pressed his lips together very hard and looked at his daughter on the dance floor and did not say anything at all. Grant Holloway near the bar had set his drink down at some point without noticing he had done it. He was watching Claire with an expression that was trying to reassemble itself into something neutral and not quite managing it. Derek Sutton had turned back to face the dance floor, and his face carried the particular quality of a man being confronted by something he couldn't talk his way out of. Not because anyone was confronting him directly, but because the situation itself had become the confrontation, and he was in it, whether he chose to be or not. Claire came to a stop. She had moved approximately 8 feet from where she had started, which was not far by any objective measure, but she was standing, and she was upright, and her hands were still holding Lucas's arms, and the floor was still beneath her feet, and the room was very, very quiet around her. She looked up at the chandeliers for a moment, those 3 enormous crystals throwing light in every direction, and then she looked at Lucas. He was watching her with the same expression he had worn since he first crouched down in front of her wheelchair, steady, direct, without performance or pity. He looked tired, she noticed. He had looked tired since the beginning. Not the tired of a long shift, though that was part of it, but the older tired, the kind that lives behind a person's eyes after they have been carrying something for a long time. She had been so focused on what he was doing for her that she had not thought much about what it might have cost him to cross that floor in the first place, whatever internal motion had sent him toward her, when everyone else in the room had looked away. She said quietly, "You knew, before you came over. You knew about the movement in my leg." Lucas said, "I noticed it. I didn't know anything." She said, "But you thought there was a chance." He considered this, and then said, "I thought the alternative was worse." She understood what he meant. The alternative was the chair and the rest of the evening, and 2 years extending into 3 and 4, and a body being slowly persuaded by the weight of everyone's expectations, including her own, that it had nothing left to offer. The alternative was the room proceeding, as it had been proceeding, with its laughter and its careful management of her, and no one crossing the floor, and the waltz ending, and nothing changing. He had thought the alternative was worse, so he had walked across the room in a faded vest, with no authority and no credentials, and no guarantee that any of it would work. And he had crouched down and held out his hand. And that was the whole of it. That was everything. The orchestra had moved into a new piece slower, without the formal structure of the waltz, more open, and the room was still quiet enough that the music carried clearly across the floor. Richard Whitmore had moved to the edge of the dance floor and was standing there without speaking, looking at his daughter with an expression she hadn't seen on him in years. Not the careful, managed love of a parent who has adjusted his expectations according to a prognosis, but something prior to all of that, adjusting, something that remembered who she was before the trail and the horse and the fall. He said her name, just her name. She looked at him, and he looked back, and the two of them held that look for a moment that contained a great deal that neither of them said. Then Claire looked back at Lucas and said, "You studied physical therapy." It was not a question. She had assembled it from the details of the last 20 minutes, the way he had talked about weight distribution and neuromuscular response, the specific vocabulary, the particular quality of his attention. It was not the attention of someone who had read about these things. It was the attention of someone who had practiced them, and practiced them long enough that the knowledge had become instinct. Lucas said, a long time ago. She said, "Why did you stop?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way people are quiet when the answer is real, and they are deciding how much of it to give. Then he said, "My wife died, and everything I had was inside that life, and when the life ended, I didn't know what to do with everything inside it. So I put it somewhere, and didn't go back for it." Claire looked at him. She said, "Until tonight." He didn't answer that directly. He looked at the floor, then back at her, and said, "You should probably sit down. You've done enough for one evening." She said, "I'll decide when I've done enough." But she let him guide her back to the chair, because her legs had reached their actual limit, not the psychological one, but the physical one, and she recognized the difference. She sat down, and the effort of the last 20 minutes settled into her body all at once. The shaking in her legs, the ache in her arms where she had gripped his, the rawness behind her eyes. She felt hollowed out in the way that follows. Something large, not empty, but cleared, as if space had been made for something that hadn't arrived yet. The room began to applaud. Not the polite, rhythmic applause of a charitable audience responding to a scheduled performance. Something less organized than that, and more genuine, starting with 2 or 3 people near the back and moving forward until it had reached most of the ballroom. People were standing at their tables, and the sound was loud enough that the orchestra had stopped playing, and the musicians were looking out at the room with the expressions of people who have just been surprised by their own audience. Claire sat in her wheelchair and let the sound move through the room without trying to shape her reaction to it. She was not performing gratitude. She was not performing anything. She was simply sitting there in the middle of the room she had wanted to leave 2 hours ago, feeling the particular weight of a moment that had become, without her planning it, as something she would spend a long time understanding. She found Lucas a few feet away, standing at the edge of the cleared floor. The room's attention was on her, not on him, which was both appropriate and somehow wrong. He had stepped back the way he had been stepping back all evening, returning to the periphery, to the service corridor, and the clipboard, and the logistics of an event that was almost over. He was not someone who sought the center of things. He was someone who entered the center when the center required it, and then moved back out again quietly without needing credit for the motion. Their eyes met briefly. She thought about what he had said, that he had put everything inside himself somewhere and not gone back for it. She thought about the 4 years he had spent in hotel corridors with clipboards, keeping everything running so that rooms full of people like the ones in this ballroom could have their evenings go smoothly, and no one ever knew what he had left behind to be here. She thought about how long it was possible to sustain that. She thought about how long she had been doing her own version of the same thing. In the months that followed, Claire began a formal rehabilitation program, the real kind, the committed kind, with a specialist in spinal cord injury and a physical therapist who built a protocol around what her body could actually do, rather than what the early assessments had suggested. It could not. She did not recover fully, and she did not pretend otherwise. Some days the progress was visible, and some days it was not, and she learned to live inside that uncertainty without letting it collapse into despair, which was its own kind of work and took its own kind of time. The following spring, she agreed to speak at a conference on disability and mental health, not as a medical subject, but as a person who had something specific to say about the difference between a body's actual limits and the limits that fear and grief and other people's assumptions can quietly build around it. She was not a natural public speaker. She became one anyway because the thing she had to say felt important enough to get better at saying. Richard Whitmore funded a rehabilitation center on the west side of Manhattan. He named it after a woman he had never met, Lucas Bennett's wife, whose name was Caroline, and whose absence had sent her husband sideways into a hotel logistics job, where 4 years later, he had noticed something in a ballroom that everyone else had missed and decided it was worth acting on. Lucas went back to the field. It took several weeks of conversation with Claire, and a longer conversation with himself, and a call to the graduate program that he had not made in 4 years. A call that turned out to be easier than he had expected, because the department coordinator remembered him and said they had been hoping to hear from him. He returned with the specific knowledge of someone who has learned something in the years away, not just about physical therapy, but about the particular kind of courage it requires to help someone believe in their own body when they have stopped believing in it themselves. He was good at it. He had always been good at it, and the years away had not changed, that only deepened it. What developed between him and Claire did not happen quickly, and neither of them forced it. It grew out of the rehabilitation work. First, he was not her therapist, and he was careful about that. And then out of the conversations that accumulated around the work, and then out of the specific understanding that forms between two people who have seen each other at their most unguarded. Her on a ballroom floor with tears on her face and 8 feet of hardwood beneath her, deciding to keep going. Him crossing a room full of people who thought he was making a mistake because he had decided the alternative was worse. 1 year after the gala at the Grand Meridian, Claire Whitmore walked into a ballroom again. The event was a benefit for the rehabilitation center, and the room was full of people she recognized and people she didn't, and she walked in on her own, slowly with concentration. With one hand briefly on the doorframe at the entrance, and then across the floor, toward the center of the room, where the lights were brightest. Lucas was already there. He had arrived early the way he always arrived early, and he was standing under the chandeliers in a suit that was not faded, that he had bought for this specific evening, watching her walk toward him, with the same steady expression he had worn the first night. No performance, no pity, just presence. The music started. Nobody in the room laughed. When Claire reached him and took his hand, and they began to move together across the floor, the room rose, not in the surprised, involuntary way of the year before, but deliberately, knowingly, with the full understanding of what they were witnessing and why it mattered. The applause was still going when the song ended. Neither of them was counting.